Welcome to part 2 of my Fire Emblem timeline discussion. If you haven't seen the first part, I do recommend you check it out as I reviewed a lot of important information there that will be crucial to this video. As explained there, I'll be assembling what I believe the timeline to be based on the one consistent factor between the games, those being the dragons. I'll be ignoring FE1, 2, and 3 for this as they all have remakes that will be on the timeline in their place. That said, let's get right into it. So, for each entry on this list, I'll be showing my confidence in its placement in the corner of the screen. 5 stars means I'm 100% certain that what's being discussed is fact. 4 stars means I'm not certain, but still very confident in the placement based on the evidence we have. 3 stars means that there is evidence suggesting a game should be placed where it is, but it's not necessarily bulletproof. 2 stars means that there is very little evidence suggesting a game should be placed where it is. Finally, 1 star means that the game has nothing tying it to the rest of the series and has just been thrown in the timeline for the sake of completion. I don't intend to use that ranking today, but we will see. Anyway, let's get started on the timeline. Right off the bat, we can get a solid foundation. FE1 through 5 in the remakes are all directly connected to one another, so we don't need to go into much depth regarding them. FE4 and 5 are at the beginning here, followed by 11, 15, and 12. We can make another easy placement with FE13, dropping it at the end of the timeline, 2,000 years after FE12. Moving on to 3 houses, this one's also fairly simple to place. Like we talked about in part 1, Rhea shows clear signs of degeneration, and Sothis is a divine dragon. With these ties, it's pretty clear it takes place sometime after the first 5 games. Placing it specifically is a bit tricky, but we do have a few things we can work with. Fodlan has a pretty lengthy timeline, and considering the advancement of the Agarthans, I'd lead towards placing it before FE13. While you could argue this is a little bit too early for nukes to exist, it has been a few thousand years, and we do know the Dragon War took place about 600 years before FE12. We know based on the fact that most of the Divine Dragon's Dragonstones were exhausted that Sothis assumedly left before the war or sometime during it. Sothis is referred to as the heteromorphic vessel a couple times, so we know she was actively shifting between forms. Adding in the 600 years before the Arcanea games, and another 2000 based on Fodlan's timeline, that's more than enough considering that Sothis helped with the advancement of humanity. It's not an absolutely solid placement, but we can safely put it between FE12 and 13, a bit closer to the Awakening side. Now, I am aware of the theories that state Sothis is an alien from another star, but I think this is a bit overblown. She is stated by the church to be from the Blue Sea Star, which just like most things in 3 houses is a pretty biased source. Considering the fact that Fodlan's dragons share many of the same traits as the dragons of Arcanea, on top of the fact that the most advanced technology we see is nuclear weapons, in Shambhala nonetheless, I think this is more of a goddess descended from the heavens thing than Sothis is an alien. We already know that mankind tends to over-exaggerate the dragons as deities. Echoes is a clear example of that. Now, I could see an argument that Sothis may be from another place than Arcanea, but I think the hair color here is a big factor. Arcanea's divine dragons have green hair, just like Sothis and the Nabateans. Obviously, that on its own isn't evidence, but combined with the stuff we already know for certain, it lends me to think that they are in fact from Arcanea. Moving on from that, the last thing we have to talk about for 3 houses are the routes. Unlike Awakening, this game isn't at the end of the timeline, meaning we need to consider the implications of each ending. In 3 out of the 4 endings, those who slither in the dark are eradicated. In 2 timelines, Rhea is killed. I don't necessarily think that Rhea's death, or rather the lack thereof, is an important point. Rhea is on the verge of full degeneration. Even if she sees the end of Verdant Wind as her moon, she'll eventually lose herself and certainly be slain. On the other hand, those who slither in the dark are a much bigger concern. While they meet their end in most routes, they're still around in Azure Moon. This is all to say that the events of Silver Snow, Crimson Flower, and Verdant Wind all end in similar enough spots that I think we can consider a timeline convergence at the end of each of those 3 routes. Since 3 houses came out after Awakening, we know for sure that there's no mention of any specific faction, which means we don't need to worry about stuff like that. We will end up adding 1 timeline split here though for the Blue Lions route. Those who slither in the dark are sure to cause problem down the line, so we pretty much need to consider this as a separate timeline. While we're talking about alternate timelines, why don't we talk about the other game with a big timeline split, that being Fates. Surprisingly, it's in a pretty similar spot to 3 houses. Considering what we talked about in part 1, Anankos is another degenerating divine dragon. We know the other dragons of Fates took measures to avoid degeneration, which implies they're all likely tied to Arcanea in some way. Korn is an exceptionally typical Manakee with his pointed ears and Dragonstone. The only major difference here is the canonical hair color, which isn't green. On top of that, with how the records talk about things, the Dragon War of Fates may have been an extension, or perhaps parallel to the one that took place in Arcanea. It doesn't seem super likely that the Divine Dragons migrated from Arcanea, so they may have just been another country. We do know that they certainly take place in the same world thanks to some dialogue from the Before Awakening DLC map. Considering they talk about Hoshido and Nor in a similar tone they used to talk about Marth in his games, I'd say Fates likely would take place sometime before FE4. Anankos did just begin Degeneration after maintaining his dragon form the entire time, so this makes sense to have an early placement. Moving on to the timeline splits, they're definitely a lot more drastic than Three Houses. That said, the endings of Conquest and Birthright are basically the same, with one kingdom having won the war and Anankos remaining undiscovered. Looking at how Anankos is operated, we'd likely be looking at an FE4 situation later down the line for these routes. Obviously, since this doesn't happen as far as any of the lore indicates, and the fact that the records of both Hoshido and Nor persisted through to FE13, I think we can confirm that Revelations is the main timeline. That leaves Conquest and Birthright to diverge into their own timelines, which we never see a follow-up on. That said, we are making good progress here. All we have left to place now are the Tellius games, Elebe games, the Sacred Stones, and Engage. These, of course, are all somewhat outliers from the typical formula. They don't quite fit nicely with the established lore of these games to varying degrees, but let's start with Elebe. The history of the dragons in Elebe differs pretty significantly from those in the rest of the series. While there are some similar elements, such as many of the dragon types from FE1 reappearing, in addition to the demon dragons coming up in both FE6 and FE14, there are also a lot of differences. The Scouring placed humanity in a position of power over the dragons, rather than the more typical prey or servant situation in other games. Degeneration also doesn't seem to be an issue here, or at least not a significant one. The endless winter was the cause of dragons becoming Manichees here, an environmental issue, not a biological one. It doesn't mean that degeneration can't be a factor, just that dragons never lived long enough to encounter it. I would say that all of this implies Elebe is in another timeline compared to the rest of the series. While the Scouring itself could have taken place on an isolated continent, the Endless Winter definitely couldn't have. As such, I'll have to add in my own timeline split somewhere. Before the Scouring, humanity and dragonkind coexisted, with mankind initiating the war on them. We know there were many dragon tribes involved, and also the divine dragons who remained neutral. With how different this is from the background of Arcanea and its dragons, I think we'll need to place this in an entirely separate timeline. I know it is a bit of a cop-out to say these games are in two separate timelines entirely, but there really isn't any way for them to exist together with lore conflicts. Besides, it's not like Fire Emblem has strayed away from alternate timelines, if the last two games discussed were any indicator. Moving on, we'll get right into the newest game in the series, Engage. As mentioned before, Engage is also an odd case. It's one of the few games where dragons don't have pointed ears in their human forms, another being FE7 with Nils and Ninian, as well as FE8 with Myrrh. In addition to this, we don't see degeneration as a serious issue. Taking both of these factors into consideration, there is a notable tie to the Elebian games. There is a lot to unpack here, so I just want to go over the facts. Let's start by discussing the Dragon's Gate. Dragon's Gates appear in two continents in the series, one in Fates and one in Elebe. The one in Fates, first and foremost, is a DLC portal, but it does also function in the lore a bit. Here, the Dragon's Gate is used twice, once by the party as mentioned in the part about Fates, where they travel to Elise in the future and encounter Crom and friends. The second is in the lore, where a fragment of Anankos used it to recruit Owain, Sevra, and Inigo from Elise. In both instances, it sends them forward in time and to another continent. The Dragon's Gate in Elebe is a little bit different. There's no indicator it moves their position in time, but it is used to access another world. It's first used by the dragons to escape the Scouring, leaving Elebe for some far-off land. We don't know too much about this land beyond the fact that it is inhabited and not just some pocket dimension for some dragons to hang out in. We also know that the gate can be opened from only the Elebian side. Going back to Engage, I want to make the case that the land on the other side of Elebe's Dragon's Gate is Elios. For starters, the timelines do line up pretty well, with the Scouring and Sombron's war both taking place about 1,000 years ago. I believe Sombron was likely a victim of the Scouring. In his backstory, his parents were killed in a war and he was sent through a gate to another world, left with only the Emblem of Foundations. He was raised for a short while in this world before starting a war to collect the Emblem Rings. During this war, he allied himself with Zephyia, a mage dragon who is also from another world, likely Elebe. Mage dragons exclusively appear in Arcanea and Elebe, so I think this is another small piece of evidence that leans towards this connection. While Ninian and Nils were stated to have lived in peace, we don't have much of a timeline beyond the fact that they entered the Dragon's Gate sometime during the Scouring and returned during the events of the Blazing Blade. Sombron did enter during the Scouring as well, but we don't really have a time frame. If he entered near the beginning of the Scouring and Ninian and Nils entered years later, things could still line up well. Sombron's war could have ended before they even came to Elyos, considering the Scouring lasted many years. There's also the chance that Elyos isn't the only continent in that world, and Ninian and Nils spent time elsewhere. I could continue rambling on about more small details, but I'll leave things there. Going back to the timeline, we now have a new third timeline with just Elyos. The Dragon's Gate, however, connects these two timelines together. Moving on, let's talk about the Sacred Stones. This is another really difficult one. Magval's history is pretty much entirely separate from anything else in the series. The only dragons we can use to connect it are Mur and Morva. Beyond them, we really don't have anything. The main antagonist being the Demon King is very atypical for a Fire Emblem game, and it conflicts with the other known source of undead, that being Fornius. There isn't an immediate connection between Fomortis and Fornius, so we'll have to look into the Manicheets. I mentioned before that there were only a few games where the Manicheets don't have pointed ears, with FE8 being one of them. We never see Morva's ears thanks to his very convenient attire, but we can see that Mur's are round. To go on a tangent about ears for a moment, the purity of one's dragon blood doesn't necessarily correlate with ear shape in human form. We know this thanks to Korin. Korin is the child of Anankos, a dragon, and Mikoto, a human. Similarly, Ninian and Nils are the children of Einir, a dragon, and Nurgle, a human. Despite the fact that both are half-dragons, Korin's ears are pointy while Ninian and Nils's are round. That's all to say that, at least based on the limited amount we've seen, half-dragons in the Arcanea timeline have pointy ears, while half-dragons in the Aleb timeline have round ears. This would seem true based on Vale and Lear too, as their mothers are unknown but likely human. Lumera throws a wrench in this though. She is, as far as we can tell, a full dragon. Despite this, her ears are round. That said, I think this does give us a bit more evidence to work with. Lumera is a native to Elyos, unlike Sombron, and her rounded ears suggest that the dragons of Elyos' timeline have rounded ears naturally in their human forms. This also solves the uncertainty of Vale and Alir's parents, as they could easily be either dragon or man and still have rounded ears, assuming their mothers were native to Elyos. All that said, let's go back to FE8 and Mur. Looking into all the lore I could possibly find, there was no information regarding her parents at all beyond the fact that they died. That said, the fact that she has rounded ears disqualifies the Sacred Stones from being in the Arcanean timeline. Considering there's no evidence to indicate either of her parents were humans, I'm going to be assuming she's a full dragon, the same as Lumera. As such, having rounded ears as a full dragon, it would place Magval in the third timeline with Elyos. I do wish I could make a more solid placement, but considering that we're talking about FE8 here, I think this will have to do. If any of you can think of more evidence to place FE8 more solidly, please do let me know in the comments section. For now, we'll have to leave it here solely based on the shape of Mur's ears. As for whether it goes before or after Engage, again, we don't really have much. Considering the number of Draco zombies in the Lagdo ruins, I'm inclined to place it after, just due to the amount of them. Since there's no lore surrounding their downfall, we don't really have much to go on, so this placement is a bit loose. With all that complete, we finally reach the last pair of games, Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. Again, these games fall pretty far from the established canon of the others. For starters, Ashura and Yune are probably not dragons, and the Dragon Lagoos are very different from Manicheets. We also have the Great Flood to consider. We do know for a fact that Teleus is in the same world as Arcanea due to Priam's existence and awakening. That said, figuring out where in the timeline it goes will be tricky. Sadly, these are the only games in the series where we cannot use dragons as a through line. The Dragon Lagoos of Teleus are incredibly different from the other dragons in the series. They don't use dragon stones, they don't degenerate, and anyone who isn't pure Lagoos can't transform. The closest dragons we have to the Lagoos are Sothis' children. They also don't use external dragon stones, though their hearts probably fulfill a similar role. Even if you could make a connection there, degeneration is a factor in Three Houses, while it's not an issue for the dragons of Teleus. As far as the facts are concerned, the Dragon Lagoos are an entirely separate species, only sharing similar appearances. To entertain some rampant speculation, let's ignore Priam's existence for a moment. We'll assume he's confirmed to be non-canon. This would open up the possibility for other timelines to be connected to Teleus instead of the Arcanean one. For starters, this would solve our degeneration issue, as it appears that the dragons of the second and third timelines don't face that threat. That said, they still do use dragon stones. There also aren't any shifters in this timeline, unlike the main timeline, which features creatures similar to the Lagoos, such as the Kitsune and Wolfskin from Fates and the Tagyel from Awakening. The Tagyel specifically are implied to be the descendants of Lagoos, despite the fact that they do require stones to transform. Additionally, those who are not of pureblood are able to transform using the beast stones explicitly in the lore and in the gameplay. This could imply something about the dragons, but again, there are some issues. While it's clear there was a change over time in the Beast Lagoos, the dragons have remained pretty consistent across the Arcaneian timeline. Even ancient dragons like Naga use stones to transform. I think it would be best to conclude that the dragon Lagoos we see are similar to the wyverns we see in other games. Physiologically similar, but genetically very different. With dragons ruled out as a connection, what other information do we have to go on? There is the existence of the Great Flood, which, depending on how you see things, could fit in a couple of locations. Knowing this flood happened and significantly changed the surface of the world, we can rule out some options. We know it can't possibly take place after Marth's games, since Elise and Arcanea are widely the same. While it does require some speculation, knowing that Gare traveled from Yggdrasil to Arcanea before the events of FE4 could tell us where FE9 and 10 take place if we knew how he got there. Considering it hasn't been too many hundreds of years between FE4 and 1, as well as the fact that there's no mention of a flood in either Arcanea or Yggdrasil's records, I think it's safe to say that the flood occurred at the very beginning of the timeline. Considering there's no mention of a flood in any of Fates' lore either, I think it's safe to place the Tellius games at the very beginning of the timeline. With that, I think I'll leave the timeline here. I know this isn't anything radically different from what other people have proposed, but I wanted to go into depth into my reasonings behind the placements, as well as how firm they actually were. Of course, I'm not perfect, and there may have been some crucial lore bits that I missed. If that's the case, please make sure to let me know in the comments section below. If there's any significant details I missed, I may make a follow-up to this one when the next non-remake game comes out, and I'll include those details in the update of my timeline. That said, that's everything I have for you today. Thank you all so much for watching this, and if you're interested in seeing more Fire Emblem content in the future, or just content about other game series, make sure to subscribe and check out some of my other videos. Thanks, and have a great day.